is going to be online, given by Sarah Green on precision medicine. So you're all invited to join us. If you want to join to this Zoom lecture, please go to the website and register for the lecture. On Tuesday next week, it's also an online event. It's going to be the second event of the former fellow series, where we're bringing back former fellows to talk to us. And on this occasion, the speaker will be Yann Benetro-Dupin, who was a postdoc here a few years ago, and he will be talking about peer reviewing. He's working actually now for PLOS 1. He has actually an important job there, so he will give us his insight from the inside of the world. And it's about whether peer reviewing is worth doing and worth reading, whether it's worth reading peer reviews, which I already know the answer. You might guess what it is, but as both a reviewer, an author, and an editor, so most of the time it's pretty clear what the answer is. In any case, today it's my great pleasure to introduce Hyundeuk Cheon, who is an associate professor at Seoul National University, the Department of Philosophy, and also the program in History and Philosophy of Science. And so Hyundeuk is also coming back to Pittsburgh. He was a visiting graduate student with us in History and Philosophy of Science. A few years ago, I have to say.
Yeah, more than 10 years ago.
For quite a long time. We've done a lot together. So it's really a pleasure to have him back with us today. Hyundeuk worked on a range of topics in general philosophy of science, but also in philosophy of cognitive science, philosophy of technology. He's published extensively in both English and Korean. And his most recent project, and the talk will be connected to that, is about AI. And more precisely, I don't know whether the talk will be about that, but when we talked, when he told me about autonomous weapon systems, how we can kill others without hurting our hands. So that's, I don't know whether we'll hear a bit about that today. But in any case, today's talk is explicating the principle of explicability. How is yours?
Yeah, thanks, Edward, for a general introduction. Thanks for coming. So it's my great pleasure to have this opportunity to share my idea on the artificial intelligence. So actually, I was not the philosopher of AI before the 2016, when I was shocked by the Go game between the Isidore and AlphaGo. And then I found many philosophically interesting topics there, ranging from the ethical issues of autonomous weapon system and self-driving cars, and some social issues in the human AI interface. Actually, this Korean version of 10 actually. So there is a Facebook-based AI chatbot program, but after launching, 1 month after launching, it declined the service due to some ethical and social issues, like the cases. So it's Korean, but AI chatbot Ruda makes offensive remarks of the gay, lesbian, and LGBT peoples. So today I'm going to talk about the principle of explicability for the artificial intelligence. So I believe that philosophy is needed in the place where there's some conceptual confusion or conceptual unclarity or conceptual issues. So I think in this respect, explainable AI, XAI, is the right place for the philosophers to engage in. So I think that each author has some insight and some correct ingredient, but the connections between them are very loose and sometimes is inconsistent. So my goal today is to look the current debate and take some several the component apart and recombine them in the coherent manner. So here's content, how I proceed. First of all, I want to introduce the principle of the explicability. And then I want to talk about the who question and why question and what question of the explicability. So the AI ethics, right? So with the development of AI, there's growing concern about the ethical and responsible uses of the AI algorithms. So many AI ethic guidelines and the principles came out, posing the problem of principle proliferation. The name is by the Floridi. So the volume of the principle and guidelines are huge and overwhelming. So if they are unnecessary repetitive, then it's waste of time and energy. We don't repeat the same content in the different publications. If they are significantly different from each other, then they will result in market for principles where the stakeholders may be tempted to shop what they want, what they prefer. So, but fortunately, according to the meta-analysis on the ethic guidelines, there's some common principles and core principles that can be found in the many or most of the ethic guidelines. So one of the meta-analysis is done by Jobin and colleagues, published in the Nature Machine Intelligence. So they reviewed the 84 documents. They distilled 11 overarching ethical values and principles, and the transparency is the first one. And I want to focus on the next one by the Floridi and Coase. So they review on the 6 high-profile initiatives established in the interest of socially beneficial AI, and this list of the ethic guidelines. And the result is that they find 5 core principles among 46 principles. There's so many principles, but they distilled 5 core principles. And interesting thing is that the 4 core principles are commonly used in the bioethics. So there's a principle of the beneficency, principles of non-maleficence, principle of autonomy, and principle of justice are in the biomedical ethics. And they are corresponding the 4 major ethical principles in AI ethics. Although there are some mismatch or the misinterpretation of that principles. So there's no direct the perfect translation from the bioethics to AI ethics, but the principles can be good to start point for the looking at what's going on in the AI ethics. But the 4 principles are not exhaustive. The Floridi said that the new principle is needed. That's the explicability. So what is that? Actually, there's wide consensus on the importance of that principle. So GDPR is often interpreted as the right to explanation when the automated decision-making affects significantly the summon. And the Future of Life Institute claimed there are 2 versions of the transparency principles. According to failure transparency, if AI system causes harm, it should be possible to ascertain why. According to judicial transparency, any involvement by the autonomous system in judicial decision-making should provide satisfactory explanation auditable by the competent human authority. And Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella claimed that AI must be transparent to very similar things. So I'm not saying that all of these are exactly the same. Actually, there's a little bit different from each other, but they are quite similar and can be incorporated into incorporate under the overarching principles. But that's the Floridi's idea. That is the explicability. So he put a notion of explicability as incorporating both epistemological sense of intelligibility, or for the non-expert, for an expert as well, and the ethical sense of accountability. So the former concerns answer to the question, how does it work? And the latter concerns the answer to the question, who is responsible for the way it works? But there's some unresolved unclarity on the why and who and what question. So it's unclear why it is needed at the first place. He just reviewed the literatures, and he finds some generality and commonality, but why we need it? That's the first question. And then to whom machine learning algorithm is explicable, the second question. And the what question has three mini questions. What is intelligibility, what is accountability, and how they are related. So let's set the stage. So what is the machine learning algorithm is doing? It's basically the prediction and the classification or ranking. So the companies or the authorities can use the recommendation system or decision-making system based on the classification and ranking made by the AI algorithm. So how the automated decision-making system using AI algorithm works? First of all, we need to define the problem, and then collect data and build model and training data with the data collected and testing the models, and then apply to the real world situation. And that process will be iterated and again. And I would suppose that machine learning algorithm produce robust outcomes. They are not just random or chaotic patterns, significantly sensitive to small changes in the input. Only in the situations of the robust outcome, the local explanation become possible and effective. If just the random cases, we can't explain what is going on in there. So now the algorithm decision-making system is used in the real world situation, like the loan application, job application, judicial sentencing, political policy, and so on and so forth. So they are used in the morally significant situations. Either they involve the direct assessment of the human's personal capacity or character or the properties, or they affect the health condition or life of the people's human beings, right? So what the principle state exactly? Is it a requirement that every application of AI algorithm must be explicable? Or is it recommended? Or is it desirable? Or is it saying that it is morally wrong to use inexplicable AI in certain context? So to make the principle clearer, we can take advantage of analogy with the biomedical ethics again. So the four principles of the biomedical ethics are usually regarded as a prima facie duties. It needs to be balanced with other principles, right, when applying to the particular cases. So it can be overruled by another principle when they are related for that. So likewise, we can take explicability as a prima facie duty. It means that it doesn't trump another, right? Of course, there's some limiting questions in practical question, how to deal with situations where different principles conflict. But that's a question, but I want to put it aside today. So the explicability principle states that there's prima facie duty to make AI explicable when they are used in the morally significant situations. Then, who has the duty to whom? That's the who question. So there are three main laws in the decision-making cycles or chain. First law is algorithm developers and engineers and designers. The second law is the algorithm users. the professionals working in tandem with the system, or the who use the system to make decisions that affect on individuals. They are the decision makers. And there are decision recipients, who are individuals or groups of people who are influenced by the system decision. So they are the three main laws. Typically, the three laws can be separated. The designers build a system on users' request, and users make decisions about applicants who are affected by the decisions. In the law application cases or in the parallel cases, these three distinct laws can play. But there are some cases where the one stakeholders can play multiple laws at the same time. For example, one people or group of people can be both as a decision maker and a decision recipient, where their decision affect themselves. So when we use the recommended system, like in the Netflix or the Amazon, we made a decision suggested by the recommended system, and our decision affect ourselves. So in these cases, the algorithm users are the same as the decision recipient, right? But medical AI is quite complex cases, so I leave it aside now. And who question again? So to whom machine learning algorithm is explicable? So there are three possible answers, right? One might say the algorithm needs to be explicable to the developers. One might say to the decision makers or to decision recipient. But before to answer the question, we can think about the link between the who question and why question. They are closely related. So there are some possible answers to the why question. One might say that it is necessary to comply with the relevant regulations like GDPR, or it's useful to examine the limitations, errors to improve the functionality of the system. First one is the practical issue, but it's not the fundamental issue. It's not the ethical issues, right? We are seeking for the answer on the more fundamental level. Second one is kind of epistemic issue, right? So it might be desirable, it might be useful to make AI explicable, but it is not required in the ethical sense. It doesn't seem to be a duty, right? The violation of it doesn't count as unethical, even if the system is reliable without any serious errors. So there's two main alternative views for the why question: the autonomy-based view and the trust-based view. So according to the autonomy-based view, the explicability helps human working with the models and help them make their own informed decision with the model. And according to trust-based view, it is instrumental to enhance the trust of the decision recipient on the machine learning algorithm and its result. So the autonomy-based view and the trust-based view consist of the most literature, I think. And get back to the who question. So the algorithm need to be explicable to the developers? Actually, I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's not ethical in character, right? It's epistemic. So it's unclear whether being explicable to developers is a prima facie duty. So we are not going to consider this view today. And then we have two options. First view, the algorithm needs to be explicable to the algorithm users or the decision makers. Second view, so algorithm needs to be explicable to individuals affected by the decision-making systems, right? So most of literature focus on the latter, being explicable to the decision recipient. That's what the GDPR is saying, right? So the explanation is directed toward the person who is affected by the decision. There's the majority view. But the former, the number 2, is not highlighted until recently. But the Robbins, I think, rightly pointed out that decision made by algorithm need to be explicable to the person using the algorithm. Unfortunately, he claimed that explicability is not directed to the person subject to the algorithm decision. So here, I want to be a kind of peacemaker. So there's no reason to believe that explicability is directed to the only one law. It is based on the unjustified assumption that there's only one purpose of the explicability. I think it reflects only some parts of the whole processes. We need to embrace both of them. So the explicability can have 2 forms: explicability to the decision makers and the explicability to decision recipients, right? And then why question? Let's get back to the why question. Actually, it is widely believed that recent machine learning algorithms are not transparent, and then that opacity is the problem that calls for the explicability. So the explicability is grounded in our worry about the black box nature, opaque nature of the machine learning algorithms. But one might say that we are already relying on so many black boxes, which we don't request any explanation. For example, we don't call for any explanation of how the engines of airplane, engines of automobiles works when we are among the passengers. And we don't need any explanation of how pills works in our bodies for relieving pains, right? So then why we want to explain for AI, not for the old black boxes like pills and engines? So what's the difference between them? So one might say the new black boxes are used in the morally significant situations, but the pills are involved in the morally significant situation, right? They affect our health condition, right? Engine might be related to the moral situations, right? Like in the trolley cases. So the starting point is that many new black boxes are used in the morally significant situations, but some new black boxes are used in situations with little moral significance, like board game. The AlphaGo played a goal, but it has no or little the moral significance. While this old black boxes used in the morally significant situations, like health-related situation or wife-related situation. So the demands of being explicable, I think, doesn't occur when it is trustworthy and users know whether to use or when to use. For example, pills are very effective and safe, and we know when we can use it and when we shouldn't use it, right? So there's no need to explain how it works. So to express this idea differently, if the black box is not trustworthy or users don't have control to decide, if users don't know when to use or when not to use, then explicability is needed. So the problem is that opacity threatens the trustworthiness and autonomy. So machine learning algorithms are not transparent in different senses. The Burroughs nice paper illustrated how there's multiple senses in which the machine learning algorithms are opaque. So first one is intentional secrecy. So companies or authority doesn't provide any information to the recipient, or the machine learning algorithm seems opaque because we have no technological knowledge, right? That's the second one. But there's some fundamental sense in which the machine learning algorithm is opaque. So a machine learning algorithm can be opaque even to engineers because of the mismatch between the mathematical optimization in high dimensionality character of the machine learning and the semantic interpretation demanded for the human intelligibility, right? So that's the issue. That kind of the opacity undermines the trust. So people think about some connections between the explanation and trust. But we can ask, will people trust AI more when they are given some explanation? I think it's not quite obvious. Of course, you can carry some experimental work. You give some explanation and you can check whether the trust is increased or decreased, right? So there's some the rudimentary evidence for supporting that idea. But even so, it's not very clear why making explicable become a theory, right? So you might have some manipulations on the people's mind to make them have very high level of trust on the AI, right? So I think that many people think that reliability is a better way to give trust. So question is whether the explicability is required or desired when the machine learning turns out to be very reliable. Indeed, in many cases, new technology can be trusted when it works well and when it generates desired output reliably. So pills and engines are such cases. But reliability does not guarantee the trustworthiness in cases where due process is crucial. Unlike all the black boxes, some of the new black boxes are used to evaluate the personal aspect of this recipient. So we don't know the evaluating process is just or justifiable without any bias or any discrimination. So this recipient ought to be treated as a participant to the fair region exchange game, I say. So we want to make sure the process is fair, not biased. Right? So decision is drawn by the correct relevant information, not based on irrelevant information. So when used in the moralistic situations, we want to make sure that decision is based on acceptable or justifiable reasons. If algorithm is not transparent, so it's not explicable, we can know what is the basis for the decision. We can know why it generates the outcomes. So we can know whether it is acceptable or justifiable. So the decision can be trusted, cannot be trusted, I mean. In short, to make AI trustworthy, it should be justifiable. By making AI explicable, we can ascertain whether they are justifiable. So explicability is means by which to examine the justifiable application of AI. Secondly, the opacity undermines autonomy. According to Floridi, the principle of autonomy in AI ethics means balance between decision-making power we retain for ourselves and that which we delegate to artificial agent. So the principle is saying that humans should retain the power to decide which decisions to make. Problem is that for the opaque algorithm, we can lose the control to decide. If we don't have good understanding of how the model works and when it works and when it doesn't, we have no good reason to choose whether to use and when to use it. So Lubin is saying the principle of explicability is primarily for maintaining the meaningful human control over algorithm. Here, this expression of meaningful human control is coming from the discussion of autonomous weapons system. But he adapts the specific conception of this notion, meaning that the giving humans ability to accept, disregard the challenge of rule and algorithms decision. So I can say this is kind of the autonomy principle. So actually, I'm very sympathetic in this view, but I found it not very satisfactory. First, it's not clear who the human controllers are by saying the meaningful human control. They must be the decision maker using the machine learning algorithm. Secondly, he claims that autonomy is the primary or sole purpose of the explicability. But I can accept that that is one of the main goals, but that's the part of the whole story, because we have seen that trustworthiness is another crucial goal of the explicability principle. So what is explicability for? Is for the trust and autonomy. So in combination with the early discussion of the who question, we can say that the principle of explicability has a dual goals to the different peoples. The explicability directed toward the both decision makers for their control to decide, and the recipient for their trust on the algorithm decisions. And now the what question. So what count the explicable, the AI? Until now, I didn't distinguish between the intelligibility and accountability, although the explicability consists of the two parts, right? So it's time to split it up to the different notions. First, for the explicability to the decision maker, the developers have the prima facie duty to make AI intelligible to decision makers to enhance their autonomous decision. Here, there's no component for the accountability, actually. For the explicability to the decision recipient, there's two components. To enhance the trustworthiness or justifiability, the decision makers and developers have the prima facie duty to make AI intelligible to decision recipients and are held accountability to the decision recipient. So we can see two notions of intelligibility here. Intelligibility to a decision recipient, I think it's met by the providing the causal explanation of particular outcome. While the intelligibility to the decision maker can be satisfied by using modeling or approximation method to tell us how the complex algorithm works in a simpler way. And I maintain that accountability is concerned about the justification of the causal explanation provided. So I briefly reviewed what's happening in the XAI field. Actually, there's terminological confusions, concept confusions there. It is called XI, sometimes interpretable AI, sometimes transparent AI. But umbrella term, under the umbrella term, the XAI, there are two main branches recognized in the literature. One is the transparency, another is post-hoc interpretation. So transparency is sometimes called the model-based interpretation. So Hyundeuk and colleagues published kind of influential papers in the PNSA. There, they take the transparency as the construction models that readily provide insight to the relationship they have learned. So it's about how the model function internally, how the model works, right? And the Hyundeuk and colleagues take the post hoc interpretability as providing insight into what the trained model has learned without changing the underlying models. So it's the post hoc explanation of interpretation because we do not manipulate the original model, right? So we try to understand how the model works without changing the original model. So there's two sub-branches under the post hoc interpretation. First one is, of course, a simple approximation of how the model works in the very limited situation, or it can mean that causal or counterfactual explanations of why or how a particular outcome is generated. Okay. So we have the three different streams of researches going on in that field. Yeah, first of all, the transparency model. The question is transparency model explicable in the relevant sense defined above? So constructing transparent models or the inherently interpreted models can be beneficial because it tells us how the model works. So the method enables users to better know how to use the algorithm. So the transparency models can be said to be intelligible to decision maker. But it's not clear whether this good transparent model is available in that situation, or transparency model showing good performance compared to the corresponding black box model, because there's some trade-off between the machine learning's learning performance or functionality and its explanation effectiveness. For example, the more the interpretable than the less accurate, generally speaking. On the other hand, if the transparent models are always available, one might think that the problem of black box doesn't arise from the outset, but it is worth noting that even though it serves to the enhancing the decision maker's control to decide, it doesn't give a direct answer to the problem of trust. So the transparent models can give to the decision makers who are more or less technically a little late. Post hoc explanation. The question is, what kind of information needed to be given to stakeholders to make AI intelligible to them? So in the black box cases, we don't have any epistemic access to the inner working, or we don't have any complete and causal probabilistic context that determine the probability of the explanandum. So it's impossible to provide a full scientific explanation of the explanandum. So there's the page is saying, and I'm totally agree with that. So it's impossible to provide a full bona fide scientific explanation of how the model works by using the post hoc explanation, right? Then there's two alternative views here. There's local approximation approach and there's a causal explanation approach. So some reject the former in favor of the latter, and while the other defend the former, criticizing the latter. The Mittelstadt from the LA Institute try to defend the causal explanation view, criticizing the approximation view. So what they're saying is that most of the XAI researchers is doing is to build a method to fit the approximation model of the more complex model. So there's two widely used class of models, kind of the approximation model or the tree-based model, right? And they are not the bona fide scientific explanations. They are claiming that this kind of approximation methods are like the scientific modeling, not scientific explanation. And then they are not like everyday human explanation. So the Miller's paper is quite influential in this field. According to Miller, the human explanation are contrastive, selective, and social. So the approximation method doesn't meet the standard of the human explanation in our everyday lives. So we just claim that explanation requested are just not full scientific explanation as they need, not appeal to general relationship or scientific laws, but let at most to causal relationship between the set of variables in given model. In this case, causal relation idea is dependent on the Woodian notion of causation or causal explanation. And Robbins also argued for the explanation for the particular decision-made system. But others criticize the counterfactual causal explanation in favor of the more global or local the approximation method. So according to Ludin, there are some constellations outside the database that need to be combined with the risk calculation. But the counterfactual explanations are not sufficient because it's very difficult to combine with the external information to calculate the decision. And the party is also saying that aiming for the functional understanding is exercise to give up on the project explaining why an AA model does what it does. So Pi defends kind of mechanistic explanation or understanding, or he defends on the objectual understanding in contrast to the understanding why something happened. So the Gestalt criticize the parallel between such modeling and interpretive method, but Pi's take it as a good thing, the positive one. So parallel between the same modeling and interpretive models are quite useful, is that because modeling can offer an indirect path towards objectual understanding of how the system works. And he, I think, rightly point out that without some degree of objective understanding, we can't have any understanding of particular decision. So now I claim that both of the modeling approach and the causal explanation approach can be beneficial, solving two different purposes. So objective understanding by the local approximation can help this making better understand whether to use or when to use or how to use the system. Of course, there should be some additional information on the limitations of the approximation method, including under what condition it breaks down and under what condition it can mislead us. And by providing causal explanation of why a particular decision is made, the decision can be made intelligible to the decision recipient. The causal explanations are the core parts of human explanation, which are contrastive and selective. So for example, of course, there's causal explanation is the first step towards accountability. To be held accountable include the ethical justification of the explanation provided, meaning that decision makers have the duty to answer the questions of justification or appropriateness of decision from the recipients. So once the causal explanation is given to the recipients with the justification, the recipients can accept or reject or find it questionable. and the recipients can raise some questions, then the decision makers ought to provide additional further the justification and engage in the process of exchanging reagents. So this process can be iterated, right? So the conclusion. Explicability have two faces, the ethical sense and the epistemic sense. So explanation or interpretation is not all that matters. And then we can have some connection between the accountability and interpretation. We can regard accountability as a justification of the causal explanation of why something happened. And explicability has multiple instrumental values, which help improve our fundamental value like autonomy or justice. And I highlighted the dual nature of the explicability, the different interpretation strategy for different stakeholders for different aims. That's it. Thank you for your.
There's 2 minute break, and then we'll have time for questions.
Stop the recording. I think that's right.
Yeah.
All right. But can we just leave the people online so if someone?
Yeah,
has
sure.
questions?
Yeah.
Okay, let me just ask Dana.
Yeah. Okay.